Hi everyone, my name is Iben, and recently I've been thinking about making a roster of animals that I would love to see in Planet Zoo 2. But because I'm a person who prefers to be realistic about my expectations, I decided to do some research about animal rosters in zoo games, and I had some interesting conclusions from that research and thought I might share with you in this video. First of all, I asked myself some questions. I decided to compare a bunch of zoo games with Planet Zoo and see how much those games have influenced the rosters of zoo games and see what the result of that is. So the first question that I asked myself was, how much overlap is there really between zoo games? Because if I was going to do a lot of research and compare zoo games with each other, they at least had to have some overlap, because otherwise I was going to spend a lot of time on nothing. Now, given that this video is out, it means that there is overlap between the zoo games. It's a bit of a spoiler alert here, but it's a question that I had to ask myself. Secondly, I wanted to ask myself what were the most common base game habitat animals in zoo games. I know we often talk about ABC zoo games, aka a bunch of animals that we traditionally associate with zoos, but I wonder how much of those animals are also found in zoo games and which of them are not always found in base games of zoo games. And with the fact that Planet Zoo 2 might introduce marine animals, I did kind of want to know which ones were the most common in zoo games so that I could set some realistic expectations for myself. Furthermore, I also wanted to know which animals were commonly used in DLCs, because if there are a bunch of animals that are commonly used in DLCs, that might mean that they won't be part of the base game for Planet Zoo 2 because they have proven themselves as good candidates for a DLC. The one question I knew I wasn't going to ask myself was, what are the most common aviary animals in zoo games? Simply because, well, there aren't any real aviary systems in zoo games. You had Zoo Tycoon Xbox, which had some mini exhibits with some flying birds in them, but they weren't really aviaries, and all the other quote-unquote aviaries in zoo games usually ended up being a single building you placed down where you couldn't even see the animals. So yeah, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to distill any information about aviary animals out of these games, so I decided not to ask myself that question and not make that part of the research. To make sure that the comparison between the zoo games was fair, I did have to make sure that a bunch of criteria were met. The first criteria that I wanted to meet was the fact that all of the games needed to be a mainstream game. The reason for that is because when you look at indie games, they are often made by small development teams or even a single developer, and because of that, their choices for the animal rosters are influenced by a very small group of people and probably aren't really influenced by how much of commercial success those animals are going to be. So because of that, if I had to compare games with Planet Zoo, they have to be mainstream games. Secondly, and I think this is an important one, the game needs to be a PC game. There has to be a version of the game as a PC game. I'm not going to compare mobile games and DS games to, for instance, Planet Zoo or Zoo Tycoon, because it just doesn't make sense. All of them have to be PC games. And the third criteria is that the game needs some form of enclosure building. That's because that's one of the biggest things about Planet Zoo. For the biggest part of the game, you build your own enclosures, and I want to compare the game to other games that have this kind of building, because that does have an influence on the roster of the game. So comparing games that don't have enclosure building with games that do would get a really weird comparison. And because of that, I ended up with these 5 games that I was going to compare to Planet Zoo. You have the entire Wildlife Park series, the Zoo Tycoon 2 game, and the Zoo Tycoon game. All of them meet all the criteria. And because of that, these 3 games didn't make the cut. The Zoo Tycoon game by Frontier didn't have enclosure building, but essentially had large exhibits that you placed down with a bunch of looped animations, and because of that you couldn't really customize much about these exhibits, meaning that the variety that the game has to offer could only come from the roster, which makes it very difficult to compare them with other games. Zoo Park wasn't included because it is an indie game and in my opinion is very much a clone of Zoo Tycoon 1, and Zoo Empire was never really a big commercial success. It was there, but it isn't the same as the Wildlife Park series or the Zoo Tycoon series by Blue Fang. Additionally, I did consider including Mega Aquarium simply because it has a large amount of marine animals, and that would be good for trying to figure out which marine animals would be in the game. But if I'm really honest, Mega Aquarium is first and foremost an aquarium based game, and that's a slightly different niche than the typical zoo game niche. I do still think that every aquarium is basically a zoo, but these game niches are slightly different, and that's the reason why I didn't include this game. Now, to find the overlap between the games, I did have to make sure that I was making a fair comparison. My first requirement was focusing on animals that are possible in all games. To make a fair comparison, I decided to get rid of all the marine animals, the fantasy animals, the extinct animals, the exhibit animals. I got rid of, for instance, an entire DLC that focused on cats, I believe, from Wildlife Park 3, just to get a little bit of a fair comparison so that the results wouldn't be skewed. Secondly, it was important to clean up the data between the games. There were a few animals that had overlap, or animals that had a species that was available in 5 of the 6 games, and the 6th game had a different subspecies. So to a point where I was like, okay, yeah, this doesn't make sense. For instance, all of the games have gorillas, but only Zoo Tycoon 2 had a mountain gorilla instead of a lowlands gorilla. So I had to just make sure and change it to gorilla for all 6 games. Some of the games also had the white tiger as a separate animal. Of course, I had to remove that as well. It's all a bunch of things like that, nothing major, but I did have to do that to get a clear overview of the overlap between all of these games. And when you look at the overlap of all these games, you end up with this monstrosity of a Venn diagram. And one of the cool things that we can already see is that for the most part, there aren't that many outliers. Most games only have a handful of animals that are unique to that game and don't seem to appear in the other games. However, Planet Zoo seems to be the exception to the rule. Planet Zoo has 70 animals that don't appear in the other games, which is absolutely bonkers. It really surprised me because I thought, whoa, there was a lot of overlap between these games, but it ends up that Planet Zoo gave us a lot more animals that we never had in other games. And that kind of made me question something. Was Planet Zoo a game that introduced a whole bunch of animals that we never saw in the other games? Or were they mostly part of groups that were fairly common throughout the other games? And to do that, I decided to group a bunch of the animals together and see which groups were the most popular amongst all of the games. Now, it was really difficult to create these groups, and I'm not going to say that they are perfect, but I did have to make some distinctions where possible. For instance, I could have made a group of small carnivores and included the otter, but the otter was very prevalent amongst all of the games, so I had to make sure that that was its own category, otherwise it would skew the results for this graph. The same goes for things like the flamingo. That was also something that I had to put in a separate category because eventually every game ended up having some form of flamingo. And once we take a look at the final result, we see that there's a lot less overlap between the grouped habitat animals in all 6 games. Clearly, Planet Zoo just gave us a bunch of animals that were already part of popular groups in zoo games and didn't really go out of their way to introduce a whole bunch of groups that weren't found in other games. Frankly, if you look at this graph, Planet Zoo didn't even introduce a major new big group that wasn't present in the other games. And it kind of confirmed what I already thought was going to happen. And the first conclusion is kind of unsurprising. Zoo game rosters haven't changed much. And frankly, that's normal because real life zoos haven't changed much. Yes, there are a few animals that have become more popular over the years, especially through social media. I'm thinking about animals like the quokka, the capybara, and the pygmy hippo quite recently. And yeah, those became more popular, but there aren't any completely new animals that took the zoo world by storm, so it's not really weird that zoo game rosters also didn't have a bunch of animals that were never found in other games. The zoo game rosters stayed consistent throughout the decades. What was kind of more surprising but also wasn't surprising is that certain groups are less popular. Animals like civets, pheasants, ferrets, hedgehogs, etc. never really appeared in all of these games, and honestly, it's not a big surprise. In true zoo fashion, those are not the animal groups that people go to a zoo for, and yeah, that kind of sucks because that means that they are also not that popular in zoo games, and that also means that most zoo games didn't include them. I'm not saying that these animal groups aren't going to be included into Planet Zoo 2 and that they are completely written off, but at the same time, there hasn't been a big precedent for these animal groups, so using these animal groups as DLC potential is a risk for Frontier. I'm not saying that it's not going to work, I'm not saying it's impossible to include these animal groups in a DLC and for the DLC to be successful, but there hasn't been a precedent for that, so they are more risky than, for instance, an animal like a koala. Again, the only game that really differs from this is the Zoo Tycoon game. Again, this is a game that really had to have it from its roster, and they had more animals that weren't found in other zoo games. But again, that is mostly because their exhibit system didn't allow for any customization. So if you want people to play your game a lot, you have to give them a big roster, or otherwise they're building the same zoo over and over and over again. And that brings me to the base game animals. Finally, I was able to answer which animals in these games are the most common. And I just took all of the animals of all the games and just put them in one big list and looked at the ones that were the most common. And the conclusion here is that there are 24 animals that can be considered ABC Zoo game animals. All of these animals appear in at least 4 of the 6 games. And these are the 24 animals on the list, and honestly, I must say there aren't any big surprises here. There are a bunch of cats, there are a bunch of bears, and a bunch of African animals, and they all kind of make sense. I can't really say that I'm surprised by any animal on this list. The one thing that I think is interesting is that the Bengal tiger is found in all 6 zoo games, but isn't really that common in captivity. And with the exception of the Thompson's gazelle, there aren't really that many small animals on this list. Again, not a big surprise either. We also know this from zoos. We know that the majority of people go to zoos for these big, large animals. So it's not surprising that they are also the most common animals on this list. But one of the things that did surprise me is that there's only one bird on this list. The flamingo apparently didn't make it, and there is not a single reptile in this list either. Looking at this list, I must say there are no big surprises for me. I think it's quite obvious that all of these animals are included, and if you put this list in front of a zoo fan, they would all agree that this is a really solid list of base game animals. Now that we have our answer for habitat animals, let's talk about marine animals. And here we ran into a problem. Not all base games had marine animals. not even all games had marine animals, so I simply just took all the marine animals from all the games, including DLCs. And because of that, I only ended up with 4 games instead of 6, so to make my top list, I decided to include all the animals that were at least in 2 games that had marine animals. And this brought me to this conclusion: there are 16 animals that can be considered quote-unquote common zoo game marine animals. Because there's only 4 games that I can compare, I feel like it's a bit difficult to say that those are the common zoo game marine animals, but let's be fair, we have what we have, and these are the ones that I ended up including on the list. And honestly, once again, the list of animals doesn't really surprise me. There's a bunch of sharks, there's a bunch of big marine mammals, and there's a bunch of sea turtles. It kind of makes sense to me that all of these animals were found in all of the games. There are 2 animals on this list that I'm not entirely sure are going to make it in Planet Zoo, and I think those are the great white shark and the giant squid, because those 2 animals really don't do well in captivity. The other ones, you can debate whether they do well in captivity or not. And that brings me to this conclusion: the big focus seems to be on marine mammals, sea turtles, and large fish like sharks. And honestly, that's not a surprise, but it does make me wonder what they're going to do for Planet Zoo 2. Are they going to focus more on smaller fish? Are they going to include marine mammals? Or are they going to avoid them to avoid any kind of controversy? It's really interesting to see what it might be in the sequel to the game. I kinda lied to you, because out of the 4 games with marine animals, 3 of them did have a mermaid. The Wildlife Park 2 game, Wildlife Park 3 game, and the Zoo Tycoon game all had a mermaid as an animal, and I think all of them had the same mechanic. If you put a mermaid statue in a tank, it would transform into a mermaid. And honestly, for old time's sake, I really hope that Planet Zoo 2 puts some kinds of reference to this in their game. I don't expect them to make a mermaid as an actual animal, but I do hope that they at least include a mermaid statue. And even better, I do hope that we're getting a mermaid staff member, because that's something that seems to be more and more popular in aquariums, and I would love to see that in a zoo game. Again, not expecting too much of it, but this was a fun Easter egg that I had to include here. We've done base game animals, we've done marine animals. Let's take a look at the DLC animals. So again, I took all the DLC animals of all the games, put them together, and tried to see which ones were the most popular. And the conclusion that I could draw here is that there are 11 animals that can be considered ABC Zoo Game DLC animals. Looking at this list, there's one big surprise for me. The Komodo dragon seems to be the ultimate DLC animal. It was in 5 of the 6 games and always as a DLC animal. And that is really interesting and makes me think that the Komodo dragon most likely is going to end up being a DLC animal once again. The mandrill orangutan and timber wolf, however, I do think that those are going to be part of the base game, or at least part of free updates, kind of like how they did it for Jurassic World Evolution 3. And through my research, I found a few interesting conclusions, and I did want to share those with you, so here's a little lightning round. Wildlife Park 3 was the game with the smallest amount of base game animals, with only 22 animals. That is absolutely ridiculous, but hey, that's what happened. Wildlife Park 3 was the game with the biggest amount of DLC animals outside of Planet Zoo. Surprisingly, I didn't think that was going to be the case, but Wildlife Park 3 had a large amount of DLCs that I never really thought of. I strongly suggest looking at the game on Steam. If you were angry about the Malayan tapir and Planet Zoo, please go take a look at the Wildlife Park 3 Malayan tapir. You'll be glad about the Malayan tapir that we got in Planet Zoo. Another interesting fact, in the Wildlife Park series, we only had American flamingos, never greater flamingos. And if I'm honest, if you look at the models and the textures of the flamingo in Wildlife Park 1 and Wildlife Park 2, I thought they were greater flamingos. I didn't think they were American flamingos, but the wiki did confirm that those were American flamingos. So yeah, Wildlife Park and American flamingos, it was a thing. And whilst it's a hot topic amongst most people in the Planet Zoo community, when it comes to sequels, no sequel had all the animals from the game before it. Quite surprisingly, I think the only real game series that really tried to give as many animals from the games before it was the Wildlife Park series. That really had really consistent rosters amongst all of the 3 games, but for the most part there were always animals that weren't in one game and were in the other. It's something to think about. The idea that every sequel zoo game has all of the animals that the previous game had is a completely new concept, and if Planet Zoo does that, they would be the very first zoo game to ever do it. Wildlife Park 1 is the game with the smallest roster of animals. I think there was only a small amount of time between the first game and the second game, and that was the reason why the roster of animals was so small. Zoo Tycoon 1 is the only game with elephant seals. The other games never really featured it. Not really unsurprising because elephant seals have been phased out in captivity as far as I know, but still interesting to see that at least one zoo game included them. Another one that was really surprising to me, lemurs only appeared in Planet Zoo and in Zoo Tycoon 2. No other zoo game had them, and honestly, if you would ask a random zoo fan if they have heard of lemurs, I think the majority would say that they did. So yeah, really surprised me. That was all the interesting stuff that I found out when I was doing research for my list of animals that I would like to see in the next game. If you are interested in my list of animals that I want to see, just let me know in the comments and I might do a video about it. But just let me know which animals you would really love to see and which facts surprised you in this video. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!